All right. So I do want to continue this week talking about Afghanistan and the recent withdrawal, and obviously the suicide bombing at the airport on Thursday, for which ISIS K has claimed responsibility and which killed, it looks like, approaching 200 people, maybe 15 of them American servicemen, and then unspecified number of other American citizens, and obviously a large number of Afghanis as well. But I don't want to fall into the trap of only talking about this week's news, or letting the impressions of, and I've assembled a whole collage of images here, most of them from the last week, though linking us back to September 11th, 2001. I don't want to simply dwell on the events of the last 10 days, 2 weeks, 2 months. I want to try to put this in broader historical context. And I feel like American foreign policy often fails to do that. We're way too focused on the events of the day and fail to ask questions about the uh, previous actions that got us into the situation that we're in right now, or what we can learn by placing the events of the day into a much longer context. And of course, it is the case that the US sponsored the uh, fighting forces against the Russian occupation in the 1980s and 1990s, that eventually, in certain respects, morphed into the Taliban, right? And so there's that broader context. But I want to go back even further today and think about this in the context of 20th century American foreign policy. And I've offered you the provocative title, "Are We Still Losing the Cold War?" Right? And obviously, the story we tell ourselves is that we won the Cold War, right? And so there's provocation just in the very construction. Um, but my deep suggestion here, the overall perspective, is one that suggests that perhaps we were not either as clearly victorious as we believe we were in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and perhaps certain ways of thinking that grew out of the story that we tell ourselves about having won the Cold War have actually hampered American foreign policy for at least the last 20 years. So that's the approach I'm going to take today. There's a lot of material to cover, not a lot of slides, but a lot of ideas. So let me jump right in. As always, please feel free to interject, unmute yourself, put a question in the chat bar. I'm probably not going to pull out of the slides very much till we're all done. So first of all, placing the war, I'd say in terror, it should be the war on terror, I'm sorry, in the longue durée history of American military campaigns across the 20th and into the 21st century, right? And so I want to suggest that there's a story that we tell ourselves about having won the big wars: World War One, World War Two, the Cold War, and the sense of confidence in our own capacity and rectitude that that narrative generates. And then I want to drill down on at least a couple of the stories, beginning with World War Two and the um, big narrative, right? The takeaway of our story, of our involvement in World War II, is that this is a good war that we fought well. And I don't want to dispute either of those dimensions of the story, that we were on the right side and that we conducted ourselves strategically and with valor in the war. But I do want to add what I think more recent historical scholarship calls to our attention, some of it not that recent actually, that we were aided and abetted, at least in the European theater, by the fact that Germany made important strategic mistakes, that they opened up a two war front when they attacked I'm sorry, a two-front war when they attacked Russia. And in so doing, they overstretched their capacities. And then the more recent scholarship suggests that, in fact, the German state, in particular, the German military, was in certain respects starting to erode or unravel because of its very decision structure. The Führer principle, the idea that all decisions had to go through Hitler, was not an efficient or an effective way to organize a state or a military. And that, in a sense, although we obviously expedited the defeat of Germany, the German military machine was beginning to collapse under its own weight, under the failure of its organizational principle. And so, again, I don't want to suggest that we didn't win World War II through our good efforts, but I think we also need to bear in mind that we were aided, in a sense, with some good luck, or to put it a little bit less glibly, by the failures and mistakes of Germany. When it comes to the Cold War, again, there's this triumphalist narrative we tell ourselves about having defeated an inferior regime, but a regime that was not only inferior in terms of its economy or its organization of government, but also in the respects of liberty and the way in which it organized society. And I do, again, not want to reject so much as complicate that historical story and suggest to you that we have to remember that we lost on the way to winning, right? And most notably in Vietnam, and that the loss in Vietnam produced a sustained period of skepticism and, in certain respects, isolationism. And then, in a sense, we fell back into perhaps some of the mistakes as opposed to learning some of the lessons of Vietnam. And in a sense, one of the things that I want us to think about today is, how do we avoid repeating the failure to learn lessons that seems to be one of the main historical aftermaths of Vietnam. The second big question here: did we win, or did communism lose? And I hope you understand that distinction. And it's a parallel to what I'm suggesting about recent scholarship on Nazi Germany. We know that the Soviet Union was struggling mightily economically throughout the 1960s and 1970s, long before it collapsed at the end of the 1980s or the beginning of the 1990s. And that, in a sense, although we did obviously win the Cold War, if you don't mind that construction, we outlasted the Soviet Union, we outlasted another flawed regime. And so, again, we need to be careful about exaggerating the extent to which our strategic decision making, or our military might, or our superiority as a political system or culture produced that outcome. And I will get into, in a little bit, the idea that maybe the regimes that we are competing with, our rival regimes, are not as flawed in the 21st century as the regimes that we succeeded in besting in the 20th century were. Third point about the Cold War: winning at what cost? And I'll point out two things here. The first is that part of the way we won the Cold War was by having a more productive economy, and hence being able both to sustain our military while keeping a decent standard of living for our population, and, in a sense, tempting those in the communist world, who could see the relative affluence advantage of the Western world, into wanting to join us. The historian Charles Mayer refers to the revolution in East Germany as a blue jeans revolution, right? That the East Germans wanted Levi's 501s, and they overthrew their government in part because it was not delivering the goods. But having said all that, please note that the period in which we secured the economic productivity that allowed us to prevail in the Cold War is the period of the highest output of greenhouse gases in the entire industrial revolution, right? And so I do believe that once we get further in history, once global climate change begins to really fundamentally restructure human life on the planet, we may be doing the reckoning of the cost of winning the Cold War in a very different way. The other thing I would point out, and there's some recent scholarship on the number of times we came very close to nuclear war. And of course, we've got the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it turns out that's one of 6 to 8 times we were on the brink of nuclear war over the course of the Cold War. And for most of that period, we really did not fully understand the devastation that nuclear war would do, not just to the United States and the Soviet Union or the continents that our countries were located on, but to the planet as a whole, the so-called nuclear winter scenarios, etc. The possibility that we could disrupt the entire Gaia system of the planet through nuclear warfare was not understood until very late into the Cold War. And it does appear again that in a probabilistic sense, we may have just got lucky. It may have actually been unlikely that two countries with as many nuclear weapons and with as much hostility and mistrust directed at each other actually managed not to use those weapons in a protracted rivalry and Cold War. And again, being honest, reckoning with the element of luck in the victories that we count and the costs that are entailed helps us perhaps to understand the limits on our capacity to do what we want to do in the 21st century. And so the final then aspect of my accounting for the Cold War is the sense of having won and the way in which it supported exaggerated sense of our own efficacy, our own capacity, our own agency in international relations, the way in which we lost track of both the luck involved and the costs involved and the near misses in order to celebrate ourselves as the victor in this war. And the deep suggestion of this part of the lecture is that this has produced a immaturity in American strategic foreign policy thinking, as well as an exaggerated sense of our own agency and efficacy as we've approached the world as the sole superpower. We have learned again and again that despite the fact that we have the largest military, the most weapons, the largest economy, the most advanced technology and capacities, that does not allow us to impose our will on the rest of the world. And I'm afraid that this narrative that emerged at the 20th century makes it look like the military and our capacity to use violence is more effective than in fact it is. And so if we then move to the immediate context of the development and the war of terror, I want to suggest that this occurred in the afterglow of the US victory, and that should be the Cold war, and start by refreshing our memory about an article and then a book that I think in many respects Francis Fukuyama regrets that he wrote, at least in terms of the way in which it was used in this period, The End of History, right? And the argument was that the end of the Cold War revealed that there was only one victorious, legitimate governmental type or regime left, that liberal democracy or representative constitutional government with a capitalist economy or a market economy had shown itself to be not only the most advanced, but in a sense, the perfect form of government. And that this meant that the US could rely on the rest of the world converging on our model of government and led us perhaps to believe, as the famous quote from, I believe it was Donald Rumsfeld put it, that the Iraqis would greet us in the streets with flowers when we invaded their country, right? So this is the first way in which the first two-thirds of the 20th century contribute to the problems that we have encountered in the 21st century. The idea that our form of government is the sole legitimate form of government, and everybody else in the world is going to fairly quickly come to recognize that and want to adapt it for themselves. And this speaks to a deeper dimension of strategic immaturity. And when we speak of the maturation process in the individual and the child, the perhaps central pivot or turning point in that process is beginning to recognize that other people see you in ways that differ from the way in which you see yourself, right? And so if one of the keystones of maturity is the capacity to take up the perspective of another on the self, I think that in a sense, the end of history narrative fails that test. That from the perspective of the rest of the world, the US does not necessarily look like the end of history, the only legitimate, the perfect form of US government. And so when we attempt to impose our form of government on other societies, they don't necessarily greet us with flowers or thank us, but instead view us as a neo-colonial power doing what colonial hegemons do, which is occupying their territory in order to extract their resources or because it serves our interests in other ways, right? And so unless we recognize that the rest of the world does not view us in the way that the narrative we told ourselves about winning the Cold War, winning World War II led us to subscribe to, we are not going to have maturity. We're not going to have the capacity to understand how others will view and then react to our actions in foreign policy. So the second dimension of this was, I think, an exaggerated understanding of our power. And there were two dimensions to this. The first is with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of a sudden there's only one superpower. It's a so-called monopolar as opposed to a bipolar world. And I think, again, in the light of history, that always was a mistake. You immediately get a multipolar or disordered world as opposed to a monopolar world. Yes, we had more power than any other regime in the world, but frankly, the bipolar organization of international relations had given us a certain kind of structure and order that perhaps increased our power because we had a rival. And once the rival fell away, as opposed to becoming the sole power on the block, we quickly should have recognized that a more anarchical, less structured, ordered state of affairs was resulting. And then we add into the mix the US military expenditures. And please note, right, repeat all the time, we spend more than the next 11 countries combined on the list of people, the countries that spend a lot of military. We spend more than 10% of our federal budget. And frankly, if we were honest about accounting it for it, it would be even more than that on our military and our expeditions. And we clearly do have the best technology in the world. Yes, there's no doubt about all of this. But in a sense, I guess the question is, what does all of that purchase? And does it, in fact, purchase the capacity to impose our will on Afghanistan, right? A very poor, very backwards country. And the lesson is absolutely not. And if not Afghanistan, then where else in the world does this level of expenditure, this level of commitment get us the advantages that we seem to assume, or that our foreign policy establishment promises it will deliver? All right, so final point in terms of the longue durée perspective, now coming into the current moment. Have we basically been insufficiently strategic, immature in the way in which we pursued the entire war on terror? And the first question I guess I would pose is, what exactly have we gained and lost? And I want to be clear, right? There are multiple perspectives from which to answer that question. Have the Iraqis benefited from the US intervention in their society? Have the Afghanis, but we could then broaden the perspective to think about Syria and other places in the Muslim world as well. And I think part of what we need to recognize is that much of the wars and use of military power and occupation that we have conducted was not of the form of a war against a government with an army, right? It has been asymmetrical warfare, right, where we're fighting a rival, an adversary that does not really have a military. It's a guerrilla organization. Maybe half the year it fades back into the civilian population. And so our weaponry, our methods are not well equipped to battling in that kind of war. And increasingly, if we are engaged in long-term occupation of other countries, we end up in counterinsurgency warfare. And I think, again, this is a near universal generalization of history. We could point to Germany, we could point to Japan, but I do think one of the questions is, if we are to not only conquer but also occupy another society, will there be a large enough constituency in that society that supports our occupation and our goals in that occupation? And that Japan and Germany, in many respects, were anomalous in having that constituency. And then the question also is, how does that constituency stack up against the constituency that wants us out at all costs, no matter what our objectives are, no matter how much we're spending, no matter whether we're trying to help build modern institutions, because we are an occupying force. And that is, in a sense, an intrinsic threat to the agency and dignity of the people whom we occupy. So the second big question here is whether we are now beginning a second Cold War. And this is obviously pivoting away from the war on terror and into the broader aftermath of the Cold War, and, if you will, the resiliency, perhaps the almost Frankenstein-like capacity of the Cold War mindset to continue to structure foreign policy thinking. Again, part of the reason to look critically back at the story we tell ourselves to perhaps try to loosen the hold that the Cold War mindset has on our thinking about a new rival, about China. And I've been teaching political science for a very long time. I've had lots of colleagues in international relations and comparative politics, people who were 25 years ago saying China is the new rival to the United States. It's not radical Islam. It is a society with over 1 billion people that's very rapidly modernizing, that's very quickly going to have the largest economy in the world. And we had the possibility of trying to steer our relationship with China in a way that identified the, if you will, non-zero sum, the areas where cooperation was in our mutual interest, where we would both benefit from the right kind of trade or combating global climate change, etc. And that as opposed to working our engagement with the world with a focus on trying to have as much cooperation as possible with China, we concentrated on the war on terror. We have allowed China to emerge as a major rival, and we are now treating them very much in the way that we treated the Soviet Union. It certainly was the case with Donald Trump, but it does also appear to be the case that Joe Biden finds the language of rivalry with China a convenient way to sell his domestic agenda. And be careful when you use that rhetoric, because it may take hold of the political imagination of the people of the United States. And so again, I think in history, we may view the failure to find at least bounded ways to cooperate with China, as opposed to simple rivalry, non-cooperation, a huge loss. And I don't think this is over yet. I think the opportunity is still there to find issues that we could cooperate with China on, but certainly it's a lot more difficult now than it was 20, 25 years ago. Third issue here in terms of our failures and the way they root back to the mindset that came out of the Cold War and our victory in it, I think is the deep failure to focus on climate change, not just as a strategic national interest, which it clearly is, right? And so climate change will destabilize nations and international relations. It will make significant portions of the planet, if it continues on its current trajectory, uninhabitable. It will result in wars over water and other resources, arable land especially. And at the same time, it's not just a threat to us, to the United States, it's a threat to the very existence of the species. We, for the first time in our history, I think if we're honest with ourselves, have to say that the probability that the human species perishes from the face of the planet is maybe as high as the probability that we will continue to exist. That's a sobering thought. That should demand all of our strategic concentration, intelligence, and maturity. And the fact that we are only belatedly starting to think about this issue is, again, and I think another indication of the way in which the emergence from the Cold War blinded us to some of the most important strategic imperatives that the country faced. And then I want to conclude this portion of the lecture by noting that we face in the 21st century rival regimes with interests that oppose ours. And I'm thinking of Russia, I'm thinking of China, especially. You could add Iran to the list as well, and then we could start multiplying, right, the number of countries that fit this mold that perhaps are organized in a way that makes them more serious strategic rivals to us than even the Nazi or the Soviet regime were. This is what's sometimes called competitive authoritarianism, meaning that there is the appearance of electoral competition, but clearly one party, one politician is really in charge. The elections are more for show than for an actual contest between genuine, free political alternatives. And that in the age of cyber warfare, and again, I think we need to remember that we'll probably never know the but for counterfactual. But if Russia hadn't meddled in the election of 2016 by using social media to propagate disinformation, to increase the suspicion and hostility to Hillary Clinton, to increase the enthusiasm for Donald Trump on the part of his followers, would the election have had a different result? Right. And so, right, it is the case that in the 21st century, our rivals have new tools. We need to be focused on how we can protect ourselves from them. And let me just be clear, I do think that this is cyber warfare, right? Not all warfare involves shooting guns or dropping bombs or using drones. You can attack the core institutions of the society by planting memes on social media as well. All right, so now transitioning back to where we are today in late August of 2021. I do want to spend a few minutes thinking about what's happening in Afghanistan. And obviously, there was the awful bombing in the airport at Kabul in Thursday afternoon, our time. And right, casualties are still being counted. It appears that there are probably at least 200 dead and scores more wounded Americans and Afghanis, and probably people from other societies as well. And now ISIS K is on our radar, right? Which is not the same as the Islamic State organization that had success in Iraq and Syria several years ago, but it's actually a splinter group from the Afghani Taliban that thinks the Taliban is not Islamicist or radical or pure enough or hasn't been aggressive enough. And so we have yet another bad actor in Afghanistan. And of course, we have to consider with sorrow and dread the possibility that this is the future of Afghanistan. The Taliban has been in power for less than a month, and already suicide bombs are going off in Kabul. So I also, need to note that the Biden strategy is becoming more visible, which is to say, despite the provocation of the terrorist attack at the airport, he is not going to commit more US troops. He's not going to have a reoccupation or an effort to reclaim territory. The first reprisal did occur yesterday. It was a drone attack, what Biden is calling, I think, a long horizon attack. In other words, we can sit in Washington and power the drone in a remote region of Afghanistan. And if the military is to be believed, kill one of the architects of the attack at the airport, and only that individual. I have to point out immediately that the casualties that US drone strikes have caused, we're having trouble getting an exact count, but it may be as high as 20,000. And probably the majority of those casualties are civilians. Many of them are children or women. And so we do have to be clear that if the Biden strategy is get the troops out, but continue to attack the infrastructure of terror from afar, this is a strategy that has its costs, its limits, its perhaps illegality, certainly humanitarian objections. I want to revisit something I said to you last week. And I said that maybe the best way to view the US withdrawal from Afghanistan is that it was a good decision poorly executed. And I want to actually maybe even retract that way of framing it. And there are two aspects to it that I think I regret now. One of them is the idea that it's being poorly executed. And I guess I have to be careful, detect immaturity in my own thinking about war and foreign policy, and then correct it when I detect it. And so on the one hand, the pace of evacuations in Afghanistan is, I think, quite impressive, given that really we didn't anticipate until a couple of weeks ago that we were going to need to perform such an accelerated evacuation operation. We have removed so far already over 100,000 people from the country in essentially a 10-day period. We hope to remove another 100,000 people in the next few days. That is obviously going to leave us short of getting everybody out who assisted us. And that is going to generate a huge, and perhaps we have to admit, unpayable moral debt, right? The people who we relied upon and who relied upon us to protect them in an eventuality like this, we may be unable to protect. And certainly if you want to say there's a failing in this, that there's an aspect of this that is poorly executed, that is a failing. But having said that, we also have to remember this is war. This is a situation that evolved very rapidly in the way that very few people anticipated and became very dangerous. And in a sense, this is the nature of operating a major military occupation in a foreign country. Things can change very quickly. You are not in control. And so I want to be careful and, in a sense, critique myself for seeing like a state in the way that the anthropologist James Scott put it in an influential book, thinking just because you plan it, it can be done on the ground. And that we consider not only the positive counterfactual, we planned this perfectly and we got everybody out on time. Please note that the Afghani government was asking us not to evacuate people quickly because they thought that would create the impression that we had given up on them, that we thought their collapse was inevitable, and that would become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And so that counterfactual doesn't seem to work very well. Another counterfactual would be that the Afghani military held on for longer than it did. But please note that what that means is that there would have been more of a protracted civil war. As far as I can tell, no one who thinks seriously about the situation thinks that the Taliban were not going to conquer Afghanistan when the US withdrew, right? So the question is not if, but when and how quickly. And the lightning speed with which they did it means that there were much fewer casualties than there would have been in Afghanistan. Yes, it's making life difficult for us, but maybe it's making life better for the people of Afghanistan, at least in the immediate sense of less warfare. And I think, again, it's worthwhile remembering. I'm going to pull out of this for a second and illustrate a point. Who knows what the population of Afghanistan is? No Googling. So nobody's raising their hand, right? I mean, just like a really basic demographic question about a country that we've been in war with or occupying for 20 years, we don't know. Right. And we're well informed people. We come together to talk about politics once a week for years on end. The population of Afghanistan, I had to look it up, is around 38 million people. The casualties in Afghanistan for the last 30 years of warfare, going back to the Soviet occupation and the Civil War, it caused over 1 million. Right. So, and by the way, the population has grown a fair bit over that period as well. You're talking about 1 in 4, 1 in 3 people having, I'm sorry, 1 in 30, 1 in 40 people having been killed, right, by war. Should we really wish more war on this society so that we can get our troops and people out in a more efficient, more peaceful way? As bad as things have been for us for the last 2 weeks, I think if we're honest about the moral reckoning, we may not have wanted the circumstances in which things went better. And the final thing that I would just point out to you in terms of the things that we are reacting to on the ground right now, I don't think, and John corrected me on this last week, I don't think there were many people in the foreign policy establishment who anticipated that the collapse would occur in anything like the time that it occurred. I think most people thought, it was an order of magnitude longer that the Afghan government would last. And again, that speaks both to the lack of knowledge that we had, the lack of understanding. And then when we have people criticizing the Biden administration for having bungled the execution of this, as I did last week, I think, again, we've got to recognize that this is a lack of humility. These are not people saying, oops, I didn't understand this, and now I'm criticizing somebody else for not having understood it. A sense of the limits of our own knowledge, the limits of the information, the limits of the time we've spent, the need that it would take to the phrase that I like is merge horizons, to actually gain an understanding of what it's like to be in Afghanistan today, to be Afghani, to perhaps not be in the capital, Kabul, but to be in the south of the country, unless and until we go through the very serious work of undertaking that project of sympathetic understanding, we're not in a position to criticize the people who are making decisions, because we are ourselves not in a position to make better decisions. So the conclusion I want to support here is that the evacuation is a mixed success. It could have gone better. We could have done better at getting visas to Afghanis, but that the bigger issue here is the failure of the mission. Right? It's not the evacuation, it's that the 20-year occupation produced a government that collapsed in a matter of weeks, a military that chose to stand down and dissolve rather than fight after we had invested $83 billion and 20 years of strategic initiative in trying to get them trained. They didn't fight for the preservation of their own country, their own military, right? And so that is what we should be thinking more about than what's happening on the ground at the airport in Kabul right now. One more point about this, the disturbing intrusion of partisanship, the claim that Biden has blood on his hands, the claim that the Trump administration did everything right, et cetera, and so on. And it really, I have to say, is very pathological that the Cold War agreement not to instrumentalize foreign policy for domestic policy advantages. Not that that was ever perfect, but at least it imposed a certain amount of restraint on the way in which you would criticize the commander in chief or the military or the policymakers. And remember, a lot of this is bipartisan. The idea that this is being used to try to undermine Biden. And don't be confused, to undermine his domestic policy agenda to gain advantage in the 2022 and 2024 elections indicates again a kind of overall political immaturity in our society, as well as a level of polarization that seemingly knows no bounds. I've started to try to answer this question. Maybe we can't pay our most profound moral debt to the people who assisted us in occupying their society and building schools and roads and bridges and a military and a government. And if so, we have to acknowledge that deep moral failure. And then there's the question about the deeper moral debt to the Afghani people and how we discharge it. Can we continue to support the people in this desperate time without also supporting the government? And if we can't deliver aid to Afghanis in need without perhaps also assisting the Taliban, if in no other way, by allowing them to rule a society that's a little bit less desperate and hungry, maybe we need to rebalance our priorities. Maybe it's more important that we discharge that moral debt than that we undermine the Taliban. Now, two concluding questions about what's going on in Afghanistan right now. One of them is the Taliban the same organization in 2020 that it was in 2001, 2021, I should say. And please note, right, that the Taliban has asked the US to keep its diplomatic mission open in the United States. That's news that just came out very recently. And that seems to indicate that it's acknowledging that it needs our foreign currency, perhaps it needs our expertise, that it has moved from being a guerrilla organization to being in charge of a country way too quick. I mean, they're kind of the proverbial dog that caught the car. They now have to rule. And if they rule as a single ethnic group, as a single sectarian group, and within that sectarian group on the basis of a very radical and for many people not particularly persuasive interpretation of Sunni Islam, there's no doubt that they're going to be tyrannical, that they're going to encounter resistance and lack of cooperation and maybe even rebellion. And so maybe the Taliban, by dint of needing to govern, of needing our expertise, by needing our resources, is going to be a somewhat different organization, might even be willing to enter a national unity government. So let's, I guess, hope and critically examine what the Taliban is actually doing on the ground. And then let's also recognize what we saw 2 days ago is that ISIS-K is a rival, that for the first time in Afghani history, the Taliban has a perhaps serious Islamicist rival pushing it may be into a somewhat different space. And of course, then we have to recognize also that the society that the Taliban is trying to rule is not the same society, that it has in certain respects become more affluent, become more integrated into global civil society via technology, and that this may present certain difficulties for the Taliban as well. All right, so to conclude and to pivot back now to the longer perspective, what should we be learning, right? And please note, the temptation here is going to be to forget about this as quickly as it jumped into the limelight. And please note that it is not front and center in the thinking of many Americans or in the media diet of many Americans, but at least those of us who are currently focused on it, we're quite likely to go back to a primarily domestic concern. We are in the middle of the pandemic. We have uh, deep issues to do with racial and economic inequality in our society. We are polarized in a very destructive way. We have plenty to be thinking about in the domestic context. Let us take this opportunity while our attention is directed on our foreign policy to try to learn some lessons. So, first question: was terror ever a strategic threat to core US interests? And I'm going to suggest the answer to that is no, that this is a direct rebuke to Samuel Huntington in his book, The Clash of Civilizations, where he predicted the end of the Cold War would produce a new rivalry between Islam and the West, that would be the fundamental new alignment in international relations. And I think it's quite clear now that um, it's absolutely the case that there may be hostile Islamicist regimes, that Iran and the Saudis and the Afghanis and the Iraqis can present troubles for us, but that they do not rise to the level of strategic threat to our core interests, and especially domestic terrorism does not rise to that level. That what happened on September 11th, 2001 was truly awful. I was in New York City at the time. It was gripping. It also was a novel threat. We tend to overreact to new threats because they're new, to exaggerate the degree to which they're threatening, to not put them in the scale with other threats. There's this category that people in threat analysis use, micromorts, right? What's the 1 in 1,000 chance that you're going to die? And please note that the micromorts from crossing the street are 100 times higher, making that number up, but much more significant than the micromorts from a terrorist attack, right? And so the idea that we have just spent 20 years of our military's limited capacity, but even more importantly, our foreign policy attention on fighting a war on terror, a war which, as far as I can tell, generated very little by way of positive dividends, in addition to costing us a whole bunch of lives and a whole bunch of money. There are the opportunity costs, the things we didn't do in international relations. So I think one thing to learn is that we have to be more careful about letting not our emotional reactions, our sense of immediate threat, our desire for short term partisan advantage dictate our foreign policy priorities. Second big thing that I think we need to recognize is that we have been, quote, boxing in the dark for almost the entire war on terror. We never acquired the foundational knowledge necessary to conduct an intelligent foreign policy. The evidence is hitting us in the face right now in Afghanistan, but the same thing was true in Iraq, the way in which we were blindsided by the ISIS takeover in Iraq and Syria, the way in which we misdiagnosed the implications of the Arab uprisings or spring of 2010, 2011. All of this indicates not only that we didn't know enough to conduct an intelligent foreign policy, but that this knowledge is very difficult to acquire. And in particular, if we're going to use our military as a lever to direct the future of another society, we better have much better knowledge, better still, we should probably refrain from that project altogether and find other ways to promote what I think may be genuinely admirable goals. But again, maturity demands that we see ourselves as others see us. When we use our military to promote what we think of as admirable goals, do others see us that way? That would be the first aspect of acquiring the knowledge, the sympathy, the cultural literacy necessary to conduct an intelligent foreign policy. But please note, there are also limits of knowledge, right? Limits of knowledge on our knowledge of our own society. We were surprised by the rapid rise of Donald Trump, by his eventual victory, right? How are we going to predict well in a world that is both geographically and culturally very distant from ourselves? Um, so, in addition to that, then I think we have to recognize that a democracy typically doesn't spend a lot of energy thinking about its foreign policy or foreign relations. And that this is especially true when the people who participate in our military are no longer a selective representation of the public as a whole, but a very narrow subset of us. And much of our warfare is increasingly automated. So most of us don't have, quote, skin in the game, meaning we are not directly related to someone who might die from the decisions we make about the use of our military force. And so, unfortunately, there's a limitation of democracy in the amount of time, energy, public focus that's going to go into our foreign policy thinking. Um, Fourth lesson, and here I think this is quite straightforward, that when you graft a tomato, graft it onto another tomato bush, right? Don't graft it onto an apple tree, right? We attempted to graft military and governmental structures in Afghanistan and Iraq into social organizational structures, cultures, worlds that were very different from our own. And again, I just want to be clear, right? Democracy, such as it is, the modern state, modern culture, commercialism, capitalism evolved in Europe and the United States and then elsewhere in the world over the course of centuries, right? It was an organic, a slow, a bottom up project. We, I think, have succumbed to a very immature worldview if we think we can accelerate that to the point where we can do it in a few years or a couple decades, and do it through military means in the context of an occupation over another society. Fifth thing I think we should be learning from this, and this goes not only to what we have done, but to what it appears the Biden administration is transitioning into. There's a perverse and self-defeating logic to the occupation of another society for the sake of modernizing it or building a democracy there. But there may be a similar perverse and self-defeating logic even to using drone warfare in a more targeted surgical way. So the first thing to notice is that it appears that many Afghanis preferred the Taliban to the US. And that is a complete reversal of the situation in 2001. Part of the reason that the Afghan regime, the Taliban regime, collapsed so quickly in 2001 is because the Taliban were not very popular. Part of the reason that the US-backed regime collapsed so quickly in 2021 is because it was not popular. It was not perceived as legitimate. And the Taliban gained in legitimacy from our occupation because at least they were fighting against a foreign neo-colonial force. And oftentimes that in and of itself gives a sense of agency, dignity, patriotism to the group that actually takes up arms against the occupier. Now, coming to the self-reinforcing and escalating logic of the policy tools that generate their own enemies. I'm thinking here especially of drone strikes, but also of special forces operations, where we attempt to target the members of an organization that dissolves back into civil society, right? And so how do we get somebody from ISIS-K? Let us hope that yesterday what we did really was to kill a single individual who was a planner for that organization. But very often they're too clever to go in to a place of danger by themselves, that they will attend, however, a market, a large social gathering, a mosque, a wedding, and then tempt us to target them while they're there, knowing that even if we succeed, we will necessarily do a lot of collateral damage. A lot of civilians will be killed. And that is, in a sense, the best thing for recruiting new members of these terrorist networks, not only in the society in which it occurs. Don't be confused. This stuff is used on social media in Britain, in France, in the United States, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, etc. Right? And so this becomes a global recruiting tool for terrorists when the tools that we use to fight terrorism end up killing innocent individuals and making us look like we are indifferent to the lives of Muslims, so long as we can kill those who have taken up arms against us. And this then gets to the final point here, which is that most people, as opposed to being attracted to an abstract ideology or political philosophy, want core security. They want food. They want shelter. They don't want to worry that when there's a strange glint of light in the sky, it could mean they're being targeted by a drone. And they also want a basic sense of respect and agency. And that, in a sense, the Taliban, for substantial regions in Afghanistan, especially in the South, was better at furnishing that than the United States was. I think I'd better stop there. We have used almost all of our time, and I do want you to have time for questions, comments, thoughts. Obviously, I threw a lot at you today, from the Cold War to the current moment. Who wants to start us out with a question or an idea? Flossie, please. Flossie, you're still muted. Let me see if I can unmute everybody. But Flossie, I think you're gonna. Yeah, there you go. Got it. Okay.
Why is it that Biden is asking some of the Americans who want to stay in Afghanistan? Is he asking them to leave, or is he saying it's okay for you to stay if you want to stay? Now, why would some Americans, and it can't be just a handful, or he would be making such a public announcement, why would some Americans choose to stay? There might be marriages, to be sure. There might be families there. Some of the soldiers might have started families, but is it more than that?
Yeah, so Biden, as I understand it, is urging Americans to get out of Afghanistan. And to be honest with you, I don't know the circumstances that would lead people to want to stay. But you can think of various kinds of commitments and loyalties, right? If you're running a school, right, and you don't think that the school will continue, or you worry that it will become a very different kind of institution if you leave, right? I could see being tempted to stay. Now, let me pivot from that, because I don't know the answer. I'm being totally speculative with you, and I should be clear about that. What I have learned a little bit more as I've pivoted back to thinking more about Afghanistan is some of the democratic decision making about the war on terror. And this comes primarily out of the Obama administration and the deep fear that if there were another terrorist attack on the US of a magnitude similar to what we saw on September 11th, what that would do to public opinion and domestic priorities, right? And so I didn't really have a chance to talk with you about this today. There's a, I think, really interesting book by Spencer Ackerman called The Reign of Terror, where he talks about what the war on terror did to American politics. And he essentially draws a line from 9/11 to Donald Trump. And he says, look, part of what the war on terror did was give us a frame of thinking about American politics in which we are pure and good and on the side of right and freedom and progress. And that fanatical foreigners who are opposed to freedom and want to impose a pre-modern form of orthodoxy on the entire world are so threatened by the example that we set that they need to attack us, right? And this set up a way of thinking according to which we are pure and good, and we let we run the risk of contagion from those who are unlike us infecting our politics. And so part of what Spencer Ackerman does is to point out that birtherism targeted Barack Obama in part because his first name happened to coincide with Osama bin Laden's middle name, right? And in part because the suggestion was that he was born in Kenya of Kenyan Muslim stock, that he was not only not fully American, but in fact the enemy, right? And so this idea that terrorism distorts domestic politics and makes us much more hostile to the kind of society we are in fact becoming, I think might be lurking in the background of Biden's urging, right? Which is get the hell out of Afghanistan, not only because it's an unsafe place for you to be, but because the last thing he wants is more Americans turning up dead in Afghanistan, given what it would do potentially to his political agenda. That speaks to the stickiness or messiness of politics, right? You've got a foreign campaign, and you are in part still always looking at domestic considerations. Does that help a little, Flossie? I don't have the full information.
Yes, yes, it does. Yes, yes. I have other suspicions too, but they wouldn't fly. Thank you.
Of course, of course. Who else wants to come in? This it's still morning for you guys, huh? Afternoon for me.
Yes.
David, it's Bob Yerger here.
Go ahead, Bob.
Thinking about why people might want to stay in Afghanistan, the school is perhaps a good example, but we've been there for 20 years, and anybody that's been there for 20 years is going to develop all sorts of relationships and goals and, desires that could very well be counter to what the occupying forces were doing, but they want to stay on and help the Afghan people.
Yeah, or they may have loyalties to particular individuals they're trying to get out of the country, right? Who they feel have maybe saved their life or saved their buddies' lives. And so, yeah, I think there are all kinds of noble reasons that people might want to stay in the country, from humanitarian reasons to reasons of particular loyalty. And there are probably some people with commercial reasons as well. John, you're raising your hand, is that right?
Yes, I think a lot of people in Afghanistan don't have this apocalyptic picture that we have of the Taliban taking over, and they're figuring, Afghanistan society has been around for a good many centuries, and it's persevered through all sorts of changes, and it's very at local levels, particularly in rural areas at the local levels, but then urban areas have also changed a lot. So I don't know. I don't think it's so irrational, but I think for Biden to say you should get out is totally rational. I mean, what if he says, why don't you stay in if you feel like it? And then 3 of them get killed, then it's suddenly that's his fault too. So that's I think any American president would more or less say that.
Yeah. Thank you. So good questions about the contemporary stuff in Afghanistan. I presented you with a whole argument about the Cold War and the transition into the war on terror. Anybody interested in challenging me or thinking through some of the ways in which American foreign policy thinking may have been blinkered or distorted by our recent history? John, if your hand immediately goes up, I kind of anticipated you might. Go ahead.
Well, I don't have any. I think you presented it very well, but I think you somewhat underplayed just the possibilities that it all opened up for various political actors in the United States. It's not that how terrorism affected American politics, it's how American politics could pick up the issue of terrorism and turn it into yet one another thing. But not only the right wing, then the Democrats, of course, are scared to death of looking soft on terrorism. And it becomes this automatic thing, so that Homeland Security is terrorism, and that's why they can lock children up on the border and so forth. It's it's a very attractive slogan for people, but I'm hoping it'll eventually dwindle in its appeal.
Yeah, and I do think, as all of you will remember, from 2001, we had a president who had won the Electoral College vote without having won a majority of the popular vote, who seemed to be kind of muddling through the first year of his presidency, who all of a sudden found purpose and almost heroic role in being a wartime leader. And so certainly it was in George W. Bush's interest, but I also think, and this comes back to John's point, and one of the things I've been thinking about is the degree to which there's a surprising consensus on the part of the foreign policy establishment, not on the details of all issues, but on so much of the framework that is used to organize the issues. And this has to do with the capacity of military technology to be translated and used for accomplishing our goals around the world. I think that's the fundamental unifying framework. And then treating most of the rest of the world as kind of zero-sum rivals needing to be manipulated via military technology. And part of that seems to me to be the way in which the end of the Cold War made things so much more difficult and complicated for the foreign policy establishment, and the way in which the emergence of the war on terror lent it a new clarity, a new organization, and the way in which the imposing of the old framework deeply distorted the nature of the new problem and the new dynamics that were emerging. Suzanne, go ahead. You will have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was just going to say, unified up to a point. They lose some people along the way, and who I'm thinking of most as an example of that is Chalmers Johnson. They lost him along the way. He became a very, very sharp critic of the, of the U.S. Way of thinking.
And I will admit I had to Google Chalmers Johnson, but he's an American political scientist who
Yes.
you want to tell us a little bit about him?
Well, I mean, he was at Berkeley where I was in political science. And when I was there in the 60s and very early 70s, he was somebody who went along with pretty much everything that the foreign policy establishment had to say. But he changed. And he took up the extremely critical position in, the 80s, or I don't know the exact dates.
I was just looking over the books. It looks like definitely he's publishing stuff in the 90s that's very
Yeah.
critical of US foreign policy.
So all I'm saying is that I don't think that it's so nice and neat that they all come together and agree with each other. I think that they lose people along the way, and it's a good thing. I mean, it gives us at least some spokespeople for a critical perspective.
And I should be careful, Suzanne, and thank you for the comment and for calling Chalmers Johnson to my attention. When I say the foreign policy establishment, and obviously, anytime you say the establishment, you're using a very broad brush. I tend not to include academics in that. I mean, except for the academics who are maybe in a revolving door going in and out of government and then back into the academy. I guess I mean people in policymaking positions. And I've been thinking a little bit about this, which is to say, it actually isn't that hard to read a bunch of articles and books that suggest that the foreign policy of the United States, especially with regards to the war on terror, especially with regards to Iraq and Afghanistan, has been misinformed, misguided, ill thought through, culturally insensitive for a very long time, right? But I don't think the people who write that are, for the most part, not only the people who make policy decisions, I don't think they're taken seriously by the people who make policy decisions. And then that one aspect of our polarization is that there's this sharp divide between academic people who are often viewed as too far left to be credible within mainstream policy discourse, and then the policy discourse, which that some of it maybe takes in some ideas from academics, but maybe those academics are the academics that are already palatable given the frame that's being used. And that if we had more willingness to draw on people who spent their lives thinking about and studying Afghanistan or that part of the world, we might have a better informed foreign policy. All right, everybody, we've gone on for a long time. Good as always being with you today. Take care, and I look forward to seeing you next week. I think we might talk about something else next week. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks. Take care.
Good day.
Thank you.